So I made a video once where I boldly claimed that Threads is the most terrifying film ever made. And Threads is indeed terrifying, and it's terrifying because it shows us something that could happen. Nuclear war, annihilation, the end of everything. Like, fast. But what about Noah's Castle? That is a completely different kind of horror, because that doesn't show us what could be, that shows us what is. Both Threads and Noah's Castle show us the same thing. They both show us a civilization heading for oblivion, just at different speeds. Before we really get into this though, as always, please remember that this is just my personal view. And if you enjoy what I do here at the Decline and Fall of British Sci-Fi, please remember to hit the like button, and if you really enjoy it, hit the subscribe button. Let's start by exploring the world of Noah's Castle, because on the surface it's recognisably late 70s, early 80s Britain, but a version of that Britain that had just run out of road. The shelves are bare, money means less every day, the government is losing control and the army is patrolling the streets, and food, well, nobody can afford it. We never see the collapse happen, not properly. There is no big incident, it all happens in the background. It's all very much like this has already happened, whilst all the grown-ups was looking the other way. And this is all done deliberately because this is part of the horror. It's not the world ending with a big bang. It's slow, it's dull, and it's all very normal. This is a civilization that is in a state of complete collapse, but it's being carried along by its own inertia, so nobody recognises that fact yet. So it's at this point we meet Norman Mortimer, our very own modern day Noah. He sees what's coming and he builds himself an ark, a house in the suburbs, fortified, filled with food and cut off from the collapsing world outside. His very own castle. He thinks he's protecting his family, but he's not. What in actual fact he's doing is he's creating a little bubble of the world that's rotting away outside. And part of the tragedy of Norman is that he can't see that, well, that rot, well, he's invited it to stay with him. He invites his old boss, Gerald, to stay with him. An ageing, lecherous, smug, entitled parasite. Norman desperately believes that by clinging on to the past you can somehow save the future. When Gerald represents that past, and everything that was wrong in society, and everything that ultimately has led to this collapse, Norman doesn't see this though, or at least he refuses to see it, because he is a man that still believes in status, he still believes in obedience, he still believes deep down that the old world and the old ways will come back and save him. But outside the castle though, the world is changing and people are trying to adapt as best they can. You're presented with two very different philosophies. First off, you've got Cliff. He still believes in the old bureaucracies and the old systems of doing things. He does everything by the book, and he's running a food bank. And he's trying to distribute the food in a rational and fair way until ultimately the bureaucracy that he believes in ends up crushing him. Then there's Terry, a rogue, streetwise Robin Hood in a biker jacket. He don't wait and he don't need permission. He just gets the food and he gives it to people. And the state, well, they treat him like a huge threat. Not because he's violent in any way. Well, not particularly violent. It's because he's effective. And Norman's daughter, Nessie, really fancies him. In fairness, she's not just romantically drawn to him. She's drawn to him on a philosophical level as well. There's this whole backstory where Cliff, the straight guy, had been basically courting her for quite some time, and when Terry arrives on the scene he is completely shut out. And Nessie is drawn to Terry on this philosophical level because, well, I think she sees it for what it is. Cliff is very much part of the old world. He's not built for this collapse, and Terry, well, Terry is. This does beg the question though, just what is the government doing about all of this? Nothing helpful. They don't support Cliff, he's buried in red tape by them. They don't go after the profiteers that are bleeding people dry. And they don't go after the gangsters that steal from people like Cliff. No, they go out after people like Terry. They go out after anybody that's solving the problem. Because once the state hasn't got the power to provide, what's left of is the power to punish. Protests are banned, rioters are shot, the army is patrolling the streets. It's not about helping anybody anymore, it's about holding on to power. And to me, one of the more disturbing things here is that, well, all this, everything I've described, is seen through the eyes of children. This is, after all, a children's programme. It's the Mortimer children that tell this story. It's their story. It's the story of Barry and Nessie and Jeff and Ellen. Listen, kids don't collapse systems. They just inherit the wreckage. They don't get any briefings. They don't get any news bulletins. All they end up with is silence, confusion and fear. They don't understand why their friends are starving, why nobody's getting any school dinners, why there's no food in the cupboards. They don't understand that the rules have changed. All they have is this very real sense that something is wrong and that things are broken. So they start acting out. Jeff gets angry, like really angry. He's properly angry all the time throughout this series. Barry, normally a reserved and philosophical young man, starts breaking the rules. Although, to be fair, he's just trying to get his leg over. Nessie finally snaps at the conditions at home and leaves. Much to her father's chagrin, she goes and moves in with Terry. And this is the one I don't like. It's Ellen. She's the most innocent and youngest of the lot of them. And she just retreats into herself. She sort of stops talking and everything. And trust me, when that happens to a kid, it's not a silence. That is a scream. Let's also not ignore the title of this programme. Noah's Castle. It's not subtle, and indeed it's not meant to be. Norman Mortimer is a modern day Noah, but in this case there is no divine instruction, no covenant, and no rainbow waiting at the end. This is all survival and no salvation. He sees the storm coming, but it's not rain, it's hunger, and chaos and the collapse. And what does he do? Well, he builds his ark, in this case a suburban fortress, and he arms himself and he stockpiles food. Then he locks the doors, and like the biblical Noah, he doesn't open the gates, he just saves his own. In this story, the people banging on the walls of the ark, they're not wicked, they're hungry, they're cold, and they've been abandoned by the very system that Norman still believes in. And that's where the tragedy of this story really comes in, because it's not a story about salvation, it's a story about stagnation. Norman's not preserving the future, he's just embalming the past. Even his guest, Gerald, lecherous and parasitic as he is, he's the ghost of that lost system. He's the ghost of that old world. And Norman lets him in, he welcomes him, because he still thinks the old world deserves saving. But the thing is, arcs are meant to carry hope. Norman's arc, well, that just carries the rot. All this in a children's programme. A children's programme that just keeps on giving as well, because I mentioned earlier on about that whole dynamic between Terry and Cliff and their very different philosophies. And yes, this is definitely still very much Cliff versus Terry, but it is also still very much collectivism versus individualism. And in this case, it is a committee table versus a clenched fist, because Cliff is the old left. He believes in the structure, he believes in bargaining, he believes in working within the system. He wears a shirt, he runs a food bank, and he speaks in the language of order. He still believes deep down that the system can be salvaged. All you got to do is pull the right levers. And Terry don't believe that for a second. He knows the system's dead. He dresses like a biker, he acts like a rogue, and lives like an outlaw. But he's not in it for himself. He gives food away, he risks his neck for people, but he doesn't fill out forms. He just kicks the door in. And that's why the government treats him like he's dangerous, because they can control a man like Cliff. They just get him so knotted up in bureaucracy he becomes ineffective. But what makes Terry dangerous to them is that he is effective. Worse still, he don't even need violence to do it. Cliff organises. Terry, well, he acts. And that whole love triangle with Nessie that I mentioned. As I said, Cliff was trying to court her for quite some time, and she was seemingly quite drawn to him. But that was in the old days, that was in the old system, where Cliff was quite effective and going places. But in this new system, she's drawn to Terry because she's young, because she's awake, because she can see that the polite systems of yesterday are useless today. That's not just romantic, that's symbolic. The show is quietly saying that this is the energy of the future, not red tape and community action plans. This is all about the rebellion and having the will to do something and the momentum to see it through. Cliff means well, but he's still part of the old world. And Nessie, well, that just repels her. The world building in this programme as well is second to none. There is so much stuff that is either hidden away in the background or just implied somehow. For instance, Mike Reed's in this, and he plays a character called Vince Holloway, and there's just something about him. He's meant to be like a violent gangster type character, and he's like an anti-Terry character because he steals food for profit. But when you look at the character, there's one, something very charming about him, very charismatic, but two, he doesn't actually strike me as a gangster. For instance, he drives a pickup truck in an era when every TV gangster was driving Jags, but not him. He sat there in a pickup truck. And his so-called gang as well. They don't strike me as hardened criminals. They're pretty ordinary, really. Don't get me wrong, he's still violent and conniving and thieving, but I get the real sense that he is a man that has been created by this crisis. That before all this started, he was just a builder or something, and his gang was, well, his gang of builders. And he's been forced into this criminality by the chaos. Because after all, he's got a family to protect as well. He's just a bit more practical than Norman. Shout out to Lee McDonald here as well, because he plays his son, Mel Holloway. And for a kid of about 9 years old, he's really good in it. To give a little bit of context for everybody that's not from the UK watching this, to anybody of a certain age group in the UK, Lee McDonald is as recognisable as any Hollywood A-lister, because he went on to star in a show called Grange Hill, and Grange Hill in the UK was huge. And Lee McDonald plays this character called Zamo Maguire, and he had one of the greatest plot lines ever in a children's show. No spoilers, but to this day, he still gets people shouting, "Just say no," wherever he goes. So Noah's Castle was made in 1979 and aired in 1980. And what's easy to forget is that, well, it does reflect some very real world anxieties. In the UK, the 1970s were absolute chaos. There was bin strikes, miners' strikes, the 3-day week, rolling blackouts. Bodies were literally piling up because the gravediggers went on strike. There was an energy crisis, an oil crisis. Inflation was skyrocketing. In Northern Ireland, the troubles were getting increasingly violent. The IRA were conducting a terror campaign on the mainland. Britain, once had the world's largest empire, was becoming increasingly irrelevant. There was political chaos. A little while ago, I heard a historian describe 1974 as the worst year in British history. Let that sink in after, 1940, 1914 perhaps, 1665 maybe. It's also worth remembering that they said this in 2023. So, 2020 was also an option for them. And even in its dying breath, that decade still shocked. Because the winter of 1978 to 1979 is known as the Winter of Discontent. A year of tremendous industrial upheaval. As I mentioned, even the gravediggers was out on strike. Rubbish was piling up in Leicester Square. And the miners were out again. They was even out on strike at car factories. So if you lived through the 70s, all of that carnage, all of that chaos, you must have been left with a very real sense that this country was collapsing. So in 1980, when this show was released, it would have just seemed like the natural conclusion to all of this. And that's the horror, because the vision of Britain depicted in Noah's Castle, well, it mustn't have seemed that far-fetched. They would have had a very real sense that this country was heading for oblivion. And Noah's Castle just helps us explore it. But why is it still horrifying? That was then, after all, not today. Britain has recovered with our endless austerity, industrial action, leaving piles of rubbish on the streets, our rent hikes, our unpayable bills and our unlivable wages, our police that don't come, our local councils that don't function, or indeed our government that's more focused on optics than it is about outcomes, our reliance on food banks to feed the poor. No, rest assured, this country has made a full recovery. Thank you for watching. I know that one got a little bit political in places, but it's kind of hard not to with a show like Noah's Castle. If you've made it this far, please hit the like button, and if you like what I do here, why don't you subscribe? Either way, leave a comment below and let me know your thoughts.